Have you ever wondered why some hotels keep their front desks staffed all night, even when there are barely any guests left to check in? It's not for late travelers. It's not for emergencies. At least, not the kind you're thinking of. I didn't believe that either, until I took a night shift receptionist job at a small, almost forgotten hotel on the edge of town, where the silence after midnight feels less like peace and more like something waiting. The building itself wasn't remarkable during the day. 3 floors, pale yellow walls that had long since lost their brightness, and a lobby that smelled faintly of old polish and something damp beneath it. The owner, a quiet man who avoided eye contact, hired me on the spot. No formal interview, no background checks, just a single question. "Can you stay awake through the night?" I laughed and said yes. I wish I had asked him why he emphasized it like that. On my first night, he handed me a folded sheet of paper before leaving. It wasn't printed, just written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "Follow these," he said, pausing at the door like he wanted to add something else, but decided against it. "And don't improvise." Then he left me alone in the lobby as the clock ticked toward midnight. I didn't read the paper right away. The shift started quietly. A couple checked in around 11:30 p.m., nothing unusual. A man came down for water at 12:15, nodded politely and went back upstairs. The TV behind the desk played muted news channels, and the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. It felt normal enough that I almost forgot about the paper sitting beside the register. At exactly 12:47 a.m., the phone rang. The sound cut through the silence sharper than it should have. I picked it up instinctively, gave the usual greeting, but there was no response. Just a faint, distant breathing, too steady to be static, too close to be nothing. I hung up after a few seconds, a little unsettled, but not enough to worry. Old buildings have weird wiring, I told myself, probably a crossed line. That's when I noticed the paper again. Something about the call made me finally unfold it. The handwriting was precise, almost too careful, as if whoever wrote it didn't want to risk ambiguity. At the top it said simply, "Night shift rules, reception desk." Below it were the instructions. The first one read, "Don't check in guests after 2:17 a.m. I frowned at that. It was oddly specific. Not 2 a.m., not after midnight, but exactly 2:17. It felt less like a guideline and more like a boundary. I shrugged it off at first, assuming it had something to do with the owner's personal quirks. The second rule made even less sense. If someone asks for a room that doesn't exist, say it's full. I glanced at the room list pinned to the wall behind me. The numbering was straightforward, 101 to 310, nothing unusual. What did it even mean for a guest to ask for a room that didn't exist? And why not just correct them? The third rule made my grip tighten slightly on the paper. If the phone rings from room 0, don't answer. I looked up at the switchboard beside the desk. Each room had a small indicator light that blinked when a call came through. Rooms 101 through 310 were labeled clearly. There was no room 0. I checked twice. There was no place for it. A faint chill crept up my spine, but I forced myself to keep reading. If a guest enters without luggage and refuses to make eye contact, do not speak first. If they ask for a room, give them the farthest available one, and do not watch them walk away. If the lobby clock stops, do not try to fix it. Sit still and wait until it starts again. If you hear footsteps behind the desk, do not turn around. By the time I reached the last line, the quiet lobby didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt like it was listening. I folded the paper again, slower this time, and placed it beside the register. My earlier confidence had thinned into something uneasy. Still, I told myself it was probably just an attempt to mess with new hires. Maybe the previous receptionist had a sense of humor. Maybe this was all just an elaborate joke. At 1:32 a.m., the front door opened. The sound of the bell above it made me look up immediately. A man stepped inside alone. No luggage, no bag, nothing in his hands. His clothes were clean but oddly plain, like they belonged to no specific style or time. He stopped just inside the entrance and stood there for a moment, not moving, waiting. My eyes flicked to the paper. If a guest enters without luggage and refuses to make eye contact, do not speak first. I hadn't even realized he wasn't looking at me until then. His gaze seemed fixed somewhere just to the side of the desk, slightly off, like he was deliberately avoiding meeting my eyes. The air in the room felt heavier. He began walking toward the desk, his footsteps slow and measured. Each one echoed more than it should have on the tiled floor. I felt the urge to greet him, to break the silence, but the rule pressed at the back of my mind like a warning. So I stayed quiet. He stopped in front of me. Up close, there was something wrong. Not obvious, not something I could point to, but enough to make my chest tighten. His face looked normal, but his expression didn't match it. It was like a mask that hadn't been fitted quite right. After a long pause, he spoke. "Do you have a room available?" His voice was calm, almost too calm, like it had been stripped of anything human. I swallowed and nodded, keeping my movements controlled. Without saying a word, I turned to the register and checked the available rooms. My hands felt colder than they should have. "Give them the farthest available one. Room 310, top floor, end of the hallway." I wrote down the key number and slid it across the desk toward him, still not speaking. For a moment, he didn't take it. His hand hovered just above the counter, as if waiting for something else. For me to say something, maybe. I didn't. Finally, he picked up the key. "Thank you," he said softly. Then he turned and walked toward the staircase. Every instinct in my body told me to watch him leave, to make sure he actually went upstairs, to confirm that he was real, that this wasn't some strange dream I'd slipped into without noticing. But the rule echoed again. Do not watch them walk away. So I forced myself to look down at the desk, focusing on the grain of the wood, on the faint scratches etched into its surface. I listened instead. His footsteps moved across the lobby, reached the stairs, and began ascending, step by step. Then, halfway up, they stopped. Silence filled the space. I held my breath without realizing it. A few seconds passed, then the footsteps continued, slower this time until they faded completely. Only then did I let myself look up. The staircase was empty. The lobby was silent again. But something had changed. The clock on the wall, which had been ticking steadily all night, suddenly stopped. The second hand froze mid-motion, and in that stillness I became aware of something else, a faint sound, soft, measured footsteps, behind the desk. The sound was too deliberate to be mistaken for anything else. Slow, evenly spaced footsteps, pacing just behind the wall where the reception desk met the back office. The kind of steps someone takes when they know exactly where they are going, and they're in no hurry to get there. My entire body went rigid as the last rule I had read repeated itself in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. If you hear footsteps behind the desk, do not turn around. It's one thing to read a sentence like that on paper and roll your eyes at how dramatic it sounds. It's something else entirely to sit alone in a silent building at nearly 2 a.m, listening to something walk in a place where no one should be, and realizing the only instruction you have is to pretend it isn't happening. The footsteps stopped, not faded, not walked away, stopped, right behind me. I could feel it then, not hear, not see, but feel. That strange, suffocating awareness of presence, like someone standing just inches away, close enough that if I leaned back even slightly, I would touch them. My hands tightened on the edge of the desk, knuckles going pale, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to confront whatever it was, to confirm that there was nothing there. But I didn't. I stared straight ahead at the frozen clock. 1 second, 2 seconds, 10. Then, without warning, the ticking resumed. The sound was almost violent in the silence, the second hand snapping forward as if it had never stopped at all. The pressure behind me lifted instantly, like whatever had been there was no longer interested, or no longer allowed to stay. I stayed still for another full minute before I allowed myself to breathe normally again. When I finally stood up and turned around, the space behind the desk was empty. Just a narrow hallway leading to a storage room and a door that remained firmly closed. Nothing out of place, nothing disturbed. But I knew better now. The rules weren't a joke. I returned to my chair slowly, my earlier skepticism completely gone. Every line on that paper suddenly felt like it had been written for a reason, not imagination. I unfolded it again, this time reading more carefully, noticing details I had skimmed over before. If the lobby clock stops, do not try to fix it. Sit still and wait until it starts again. I had followed that one without even realizing it, not by choice, but by fear. And it had worked. That thought didn't comfort me. It made things worse. At 2:11 a.m., the phone rang again. I flinched this time, the sound no longer just noise but something loaded with possibility. My eyes went straight to the switchboard before I even reached for the receiver. Room 204. The small light blinked steadily. Relief washed over me, thin but noticeable. A normal room, a normal call. Something grounded, something I could understand. I picked up the phone, keeping my voice steady as I greeted the caller. Reception. For a moment there was only silence. Then a voice answered, shaky and uncertain. Hi. I'm sorry to bother you, a woman said. I think someone tried to open my door. My grip tightened on the receiver. Room 204? I asked. Yes, she replied quickly. I heard the handle move, like someone was trying it slowly. I thought maybe it was staff, but no one said anything. I glanced at the guest log. Room 204 was occupied by a single guest, checked in earlier that evening. No additional visitors registered, no notes from the owner. Please stay inside your room, I said carefully. Lock the door and don't open it for anyone. There was a pause on the line. Can you check the hallway? She asked, her voice quieter now. Just to make sure no one's there? My eyes shifted instinctively toward the staircase. The upper floors felt very far away all of a sudden. The idea of leaving the desk, of stepping into those dimly lit hallways where the carpet's muffled sound and every corner blocked your view, made my chest tighten. I looked down at the paper again, scanning for anything related. There wasn't a rule about this, and somehow that felt like a rule in itself. I'll check, I said, even though every part of me resisted it. Stay on the line. I set the receiver down on the desk instead of hanging up, letting the faint sound of her breathing fill the space as I stepped out from behind the desk. The lobby light seemed dimmer now, the edges of the room softer, less defined. The staircase creaked under my weight as I climbed. Each step felt louder than it should have, echoing upward into the darkness above. The second-floor hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with identical doors, each one closed. Room 204 was halfway down the left corridor. As I approached, I noticed something immediately. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to notice. My stomach dropped. I was sure she had said she locked it. I reached out slowly, pushing the door open further. The hinges didn't make a sound. Inside, the room was empty. The bed was untouched. The lights were off. The curtains hung still against the window. No suitcase, no belongings, nothing to suggest anyone had ever been there. A cold wave of realization hit me. I turned and ran back toward the staircase, the silence of the hallway pressing in around me. By the time I reached the lobby, my breath was uneven, my heart pounding in a way that made it hard to think clearly. The phone. I rushed behind the desk and picked it up. Hello? I said quickly. There was no shaky breathing this time, no frightened voice, just silence. Then, very softly, something else. A faint distant whisper, not from the receiver, from somewhere inside the lobby. I lowered the phone slowly, my eyes moving back to the switchboard. The light was still blinking, but not next to room 204. It was coming from a label I hadn't noticed before, at the very bottom of the board. Faded, almost scratched out, room 0, and the phone was still ringing. The ringing didn't sound like it belonged in the room anymore. It was louder now, sharper, like it had moved closer without actually changing anything at all. The small light beside the faded label, room 0, blinked steadily, patient, almost calm, like it wasn't in any hurry. My hand hovered over the receiver, caught between instinct and the memory of the rule that had already proven itself too real to ignore. If the phone rings from room 0, don't answer. The thought repeated in my head, steady and firm, but the human part of me kept pushing back. Maybe it was just faulty wiring. Maybe I had panicked upstairs and let my imagination get ahead of me. Old buildings do strange things at night. Phones glitch, lights flicker. None of this had to mean anything more. The phone kept ringing. Each second stretched longer than it should have, the sound settling into a rhythm that didn't feel accidental anymore. It didn't feel like a call waiting to be picked up. It felt like something knocking, asking, waiting. I slowly pulled my hand back and placed it flat against the desk, forcing myself to stay still. "I'm not answering that," I whispered under my breath, trying to anchor myself to something solid. The ringing stopped instantly, not mid-tone, not fading. It stopped perfectly between one ring and the next, like it had never been ringing at all. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my eyes still fixed on the switchboard. The tiny light beside room 0 went dark, blending back into the rest as if it had never lit up in the first place. For a moment, nothing happened. The lobby sat still, quiet, unchanged on the surface. Then the front door opened. The soft chime of the bell made my head snap up. A woman stepped inside, alone, closing the door gently behind her. She looked normal at first glance. Her clothes were simple, neat, slightly damp like she had walked through mist or light rain. Her hair clung faintly to her face, and her expression rested somewhere between neutral and polite. But something about the way she stood felt wrong. Too still, too composed. Her eyes moved, but they didn't land on anything. They drifted past objects, past the desk, past me, like she was searching for something just out of reach. "Good evening," she said, her voice calm, almost practiced. "Do you have a room available?" I swallowed, forcing myself to respond normally. "Yes," I said, reaching for the register even as my fingers felt colder than they should. She stepped closer to the desk, her fingertips resting lightly against the surface. Up close, her expression didn't shift at all. It stayed exactly the same, like a fixed image rather than something alive. "I'd like room 0, she added. My hand froze in place. The second rule surfaced immediately, clear and unavoidable. If someone asks for a room that doesn't exist, say it's full. I looked up slowly, meeting her eyes for the first time. They were completely still. No flicker, no hesitation. Just waiting. "Room 0 is full," I said carefully. Something changed then. Not in an obvious way. Not something I could fully explain, but enough to feel. It was like I had stepped into the correct place in a pattern I didn't understand, but she did. "Oh," she said softly. "That's unfortunate." The air tightened around us. The lights flickered once, briefly dimming before returning, but not quite as bright as before. Her fingers tapped lightly against the desk, slow and rhythmic, in a pattern that made my stomach turn. It matched the ringing. "Then any room will do," she said. I nodded, moving automatically now, pulling a key from the rack and sliding it toward her. Room 107, not the farthest. I didn't know why I chose it. Maybe I wasn't thinking clearly anymore, or maybe something in me just wanted her closer, where I could hear her if she moved. She picked up the key slowly, her fingers brushing against mine for just a fraction of a second. They were cold. "Thank you," she said. But she didn't leave. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping just enough that it felt like it wasn't meant for the room, only for me. "You answered earlier," she whispered. My chest tightened instantly. "I didn't," I said, the words coming out faster than I intended. Her expression didn't change. "But you listened." A chill spread through me, deeper than anything I'd felt before. Before I could respond, she straightened, turning away from the desk as if nothing unusual had been said. She began walking toward the staircase, her footsteps soft, almost too soft to track. This time, I didn't look away. I watched her, every step, every movement. She reached the staircase and started climbing, her figure slowly disappearing into the dim light above. Halfway up, she stopped. The silence returned instantly. Then, slowly, she turned her head. Not her body, just her head. It turned farther than it should have, past what felt possible, until she was looking directly back at me. And she was still smiling. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe properly. My body felt locked in place, like reacting would make something worse. After a long moment, she turned back and continued up the stairs, vanishing from sight completely. The lobby fell silent again. I stood there for several seconds before forcing myself to sit down, my hands trembling now, the last of my composure slipping. I grabbed the paper again, unfolding it quickly, scanning every line like I might have missed something important. At the very bottom, beneath everything else, there was one final rule. Smaller than the others. Like it had been added later. If you break a rule, do not leave the desk until sunrise. My throat went dry. I had watched her walk away. I had broken it. The realization settled in just as the lights flickered again, but this time they didn't recover fully. The lobby dimmed, shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls, pooling in places where there should have been none. The clock on the wall began ticking unevenly, the second hand jumping forward in sudden jerking movements. Then the sound started. Footsteps, more than one, from the staircase, from the hallway behind the desk, from above, all moving at once, all getting closer. I sat frozen in my chair, the paper clenched tightly in my hand, every rule echoing in my mind too late to matter now. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing in from every side as the footsteps surrounded the desk. Then the phone rang again, louder than before, closer than before. I didn't need to look at the switchboard to know which line it was. The ringing continued, steady and insistent, as the footsteps stopped. Right in front of me, right behind me, all around me, and in the reflection of the dark lobby glass behind the desk, I finally saw what the rules had been trying to protect me from. I wasn't alone anymore. There were shapes standing just beyond the light, too still, too quiet, their outlines barely holding together like they weren't meant to exist in the same space as me. One stood closer than the others, just at the edge of the desk, its form clearer, more defined. Waiting. And in the faint reflection, I could see its head tilt slightly, like it was studying me the same way I had studied the rules. The phone kept ringing. No one moved. No one spoke. And then, very slowly, the receiver on the desk shifted on its own, just enough to make it clear that whatever had been calling from room 0 wasn't asking anymore. It had arrived, and it was checking in. If this felt real, that's because it was almost real. I'll see you in the next memory.